The day I found the key, I learned that some secrets do not hide from strangers. They hide from the people they were meant to protect. My name is Margaret Whitaker. I am 72 years old, and for 4 years I believed I was simply learning how to live without my husband. Looking back now, I realize I was living inside a mystery I did not even know existed. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of day when the sky stays gray from morning until evening and every room in the house feels quieter than usual. I was cleaning Harold's old reading room, something I often did when I missed him. The room had not changed much since he passed away. His leather chair still sat beside the window. His favorite history books still lined the shelves. Even the small brass lamp on his desk remained exactly where he left it. Sometimes preserving those details felt comforting. Other times it felt like I was preserving a life that no longer existed. I was dusting a framed wedding photograph when it slipped from my hands. The frame landed face down on the hardwood floor with a dull thump. My heart jumped, but thankfully the glass did not crack. I bent down carefully and lifted it. That was when I noticed something strange. Taped to the back of the frame was a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. I stared at it for several seconds. I had cleaned this room dozens of times over the years. I had handled that photograph more times than I could count. Yet somehow I had never seen the key before. The tape had aged and partially loosened, which explained why it finally fell free. Even so, something about it felt deliberate. Harold was not a man who misplaced things. Every document had a folder. Every tool had a drawer. Every important item had a purpose. I turned the key over in my hand. It was old, worn smooth by time, and small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. For reasons I could not explain, I felt a chill move through me. I slipped the key into my pocket and continued cleaning, but my attention never returned to the dusting. My thoughts kept circling back to the key. By late afternoon, rain tapped steadily against the windows. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Harold's chair. Across the room stood the large bookshelf he built himself 28 years ago. As I stared at it, an old memory surfaced. One evening long ago, Harold had laughed and told me every good library should contain at least one secret. At the time, I assumed he was joking. Now I was not so sure. I set down my tea and walked toward the shelves. My heart began beating faster. Slowly, I examined the wood. Most of it looked exactly as I remembered. Then I noticed a tiny brass lock hidden behind a row of books. The key fit perfectly. For a moment, I hesitated. Something deep inside me warned that opening the compartment might change how I saw my family forever. Then I turned the key. A soft click echoed through the room. Part of the shelf shifted outward, revealing a narrow, hidden compartment inside the wall. Resting alone on a wooden ledge was a large, sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Harold's unmistakable handwriting, were words that immediately drained the warmth from my body. Margaret, if you are reading this, someone may already be trying to take what belongs to you. For several seconds, I could not move. I simply stood there staring at the envelope while the rain continued tapping softly against the windows. My husband had been gone for 4 years, yet suddenly it felt as though he was standing beside me again, trying to tell me something important. The words on the front of the envelope echoed in my mind. Someone may already be trying to take what belongs to you. Harold was not the type of man who exaggerated. During 42 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times he had spoken dramatically about anything. He was practical, careful, deliberate. If he chose those words, he had a reason. I carried the envelope to his desk and sat down in the leather chair by the window. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside were several folded documents and a handwritten letter. The letter sat on top. I recognized Harold's handwriting immediately. Even after all these years, seeing those familiar letters brought tears to my eyes. I unfolded the pages and began reading. My dearest Margaret, the letter began. Just those 3 words were enough to make me pause. Harold had written hundreds of notes to me throughout our marriage. Birthday cards, anniversary letters, small messages tucked inside lunch bags when we were younger. Seeing his handwriting again felt like hearing a voice I thought I had lost forever. I took a deep breath and continued. Harold explained that he hoped I would never find the compartment. He hoped the envelope would remain hidden forever. But if I was reading the letter, it meant circumstances had changed. Then came the sentence that made my stomach tighten. I trust you completely. Unfortunately, I no longer trust everyone's intentions around you. I lowered the paper and stared out the rain-streaked window. The room suddenly felt smaller, more serious. I continued reading. Harold wrote about the final year of his life. He mentioned conversations he had overheard, questions that seemed harmless at first but gradually began to concern him. Questions about ownership, questions about inheritance, questions about what might happen to the house after he was gone. He never mentioned anyone by name. That detail struck me immediately. Harold was careful not to make accusations. Instead, he focused on facts, patterns, observations, the same way he approached every important decision throughout his life. Then I reached another sentence that sent a chill through me. If you are reading this, do not assume everyone knows what I arranged before my death. I frowned and looked toward the remaining documents inside the envelope. Arranged what? The letter did not explain immediately. Instead, Harold continued describing his concerns. He wrote that people often reveal their true priorities when money, property, or inheritance enter the conversation. Sometimes even good people make disappointing choices. I sat quietly for several moments after finishing the final page. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. Inside the room, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the bookshelf. My thoughts drifted toward Daniel and Vanessa. For years, I had assumed the growing distance between us was simply part of life. People got busy. Careers became demanding. Families changed. Yet as I sat there holding Harold's letter, certain memories began resurfacing. Vanessa asking unusual questions about paperwork, discussions about downsizing, suggestions about retirement communities, comments that seemed innocent at the time. Suddenly, they felt different, more deliberate. I looked back at the envelope. Beneath Harold's letter sat several legal documents carefully organized in separate folders. Whatever Harold had arranged before his death was apparently important enough to hide inside a secret compartment. And judging by the warning in his letter, someone in my life might not want me to discover it. For a long time, I simply stared at the folders inside the envelope without touching them. The rain continued falling outside, and the room seemed suspended in a strange silence. For years earlier, I had buried my husband believing there were no unfinished conversations between us. Now I was sitting in his reading room, holding proof that he had spent his final months preparing for something he never fully explained. Eventually, I reached for the first folder. The tab was labeled Property Records. Inside were several legal documents arranged with Harold's usual precision. At first glance, everything appeared routine. Purchase records, tax information, insurance paperwork. Then I noticed a document dated 8 months before Harold passed away. I adjusted my reading glasses and began reading more carefully. The document showed a transfer of ownership. My heart skipped a beat. According to the filing, Harold had legally transferred the house entirely into my name while he was still alive. Not after his death. Not through a future inheritance process. The transfer had already happened. I read the page again, then a third time. The meaning did not change. The house belonged solely to me. A strange feeling settled over me. Relief mixed with confusion. Over the years, Vanessa had often spoken as though the house would eventually become Daniel's responsibility. She never said it directly, but she often referred to it as part of the family's future. At the time, I never questioned those comments. Why would I? Now I found myself wondering whether she even knew about this document. I continued sorting through the folder. Near the bottom sat another file containing copies of correspondence between Harold and an attorney. Several sections had been highlighted. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Retain duplicate records separately in case primary files are altered, misplaced, or removed. I frowned. Altered, misplaced, removed. Those were not words Harold used casually. My pulse quickened as I kept reading. Then I found something even stranger. Attached to the back of the folder was a photocopy of a property summary sheet. At first glance, it looked similar to the ownership record I had just reviewed. Then I noticed a critical difference. This copy listed a future ownership arrangement involving Daniel. I compared the two documents side by side. They could not both be correct. One stated that I was the sole owner. The other suggested a future transfer path that Harold had never mentioned. My hands grew cold. For several moments, I simply stared at the papers. I was not a lawyer, but I knew enough to recognize that something was wrong. Either one document had been created for planning purposes and never finalized, or someone had attempted to create confusion regarding ownership. Suddenly, several conversations from the past few years resurfaced in my mind. Vanessa asking whether I plan to stay in the house forever. Vanessa suggesting that large homes became difficult to maintain with age. Vanessa mentioning how helpful it would be if important assets were organized before emergencies happened. Individually, the comments seemed harmless. Together, they felt different. I leaned back in Harold's chair and closed my eyes. When I opened them again, my attention shifted to a handwritten note clipped to the property records. The note contained only one sentence. Trust the signed filings, not the copies people show you. I recognized Harold's handwriting immediately. A chill moved through me. He had known there might be conflicting documents. He had anticipated confusion. More importantly, he had expected me to discover it. Someday, outside, the rain finally began to slow. Inside the room, my phone suddenly rang. The sound startled me. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach tighten. The caller was Vanessa, and for the first time in years, I hesitated before answering. The phone continued ringing while I stared at Vanessa's name on the screen. Under normal circumstances, I would have answered immediately. She was family, or at least, I had always believed she was. Now, after everything I had read, even a simple phone call felt different. I let it ring twice more before pressing accept. "Hello, Vanessa," I said. Her voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. "Margaret, hi. I hope I am not bothering you." I glanced at the documents spread across Harold's desk. "Not at all." "Good," she replied with a small laugh. "I was just thinking about you. Daniel mentioned you have been spending time around the house lately." The comment seemed harmless, but something about it made me pay closer attention. "I suppose I have," I answered. "Rainy days are good for organizing." There was a brief pause. Very brief, yet long enough for me to notice. "Organizing what?" she asked casually. I looked at the hidden compartment behind the bookshelf. Every instinct told me to choose my words carefully. "Just old things," I said. "Papers. Photographs. The usual." Another pause followed. Then came the question that made my stomach tighten. "You have not found any old envelopes, have you?" My grip on the phone immediately tightened. For a moment, I thought I might have misheard her. Not boxes. Not files. Not documents. Envelopes. The specific word struck me like a warning bell. I kept my voice calm. "Why would I find old envelopes?" I asked lightly. Vanessa laughed again. "Oh, nothing important. Harold always kept random things. I was just curious." Curious. That was the word she always used whenever she wanted information without appearing interested. We spoke for another minute about ordinary topics before ending the call. The moment I set down the phone, I felt the room grow very quiet. My eyes drifted back to the envelope lying open on the desk. She knew. Maybe not exactly what was inside. Maybe not exactly where it was hidden, but she knew something existed. Otherwise, she never would have asked that question. I sat down slowly and tried to think clearly. Over the years, Vanessa had often presented herself as the most organized person in the family. She remembered birthdays, planned holidays, managed schedules. Everyone praised her efficiency, including me. Yet looking back now, I realized that her greatest skill was gathering information. She always seemed to know things before anyone else. She always knew who was updating a will, refinancing a home, changing insurance policies, or making financial decisions. At the time, I considered it attentiveness. Now I wondered whether it was something else entirely. My thoughts were interrupted by a text message. It was from Daniel. "Hope you are doing okay. Vanessa said she talked to you today." I stared at the message. Within minutes of ending her call, she had already spoken to him. That detail bothered me more than I expected. Not because they communicated. They were husband and wife. Of course they communicated, but because it felt coordinated, as though they were checking whether I had discovered something. I opened the next folder from Harold's envelope. The tab read Attorney Correspondence. Inside were copies of letters exchanged between Harold and his lawyer during the final year of his life. Most were routine. Then one paragraph caught my attention immediately. Harold wrote that if anything happened to him unexpectedly, his attorney should refuse any requests for ownership clarification unless they came directly from me. I read the sentence twice. Then I noticed the date. It was written only 3 weeks before Harold died. Suddenly, a terrible realization formed in my mind. Harold had not hidden those documents because he was worried about what might happen years later. He had already been worried while he was still alive. The next morning, I barely slept. Harold's words stayed with me long after the rain had stopped. By sunrise, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me and a single name written on a piece of paper. Thomas Bennett, Harold's attorney. The more I thought about the documents, the more convinced I became that I needed answers from someone who had been there when those decisions were made. Around 9 o'clock, I called his office. To my surprise, Thomas answered personally. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but steady. The moment I introduced myself, a long silence followed. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. "Margaret, I have been wondering for years if you would ever call me." My heart skipped a beat. We arranged to meet that afternoon. The drive into downtown Columbus felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed to give me another minute to think. Another minute to wonder what Harold knew that I did not. Thomas's office occupied the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse. The waiting room looked almost exactly the same as it had years earlier. Dark wood furniture, framed diplomas, shelves filled with legal books. The familiar surroundings should have felt comforting. Instead, they made me nervous. When Thomas entered the room, his eyes immediately settled on the folder I carried. He recognized it before I said a word. Without asking any questions, he led me into his office and closed the door behind us. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I placed Harold's letter on his desk. Thomas looked at it quietly before removing his glasses. "So you found the compartment," he said. It was not a question. I nodded. Apparently, Harold expected me to. Thomas leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He hoped you never would. I felt a chill move through me. What exactly was he worried about? Thomas sighed slowly. The expression on his face told me this was not a conversation he had wanted to have. Toward the end of his life, Harold became concerned about repeated questions involving your property and future ownership. My stomach tightened immediately. Questions from who? Thomas chose his next words carefully. Harold preferred evidence over accusations. He never claimed anyone had done something wrong, but he noticed patterns. That sounded exactly like my husband. Thomas opened a drawer and removed a thin file. Inside were copies of correspondence I had already seen in Harold's envelope, along with several documents I had never seen before. One of them immediately caught my attention. It was a written record of an inquiry made to Thomas's office nearly 2 years after Harold died. Someone had contacted him asking whether ownership records could be modified after the death of a spouse. Another inquiry asked whether future beneficiaries could be added to existing property structures. My pulse quickened as I read the notes. Who made these requests? I asked quietly. Thomas looked directly at me. The person identified herself as helping organize your affairs. He slid the paper across the desk. At the top of the page was a name I already feared I would see. Vanessa Whitaker. Then Thomas said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Margaret, that was not the only inquiry." A few months later, someone attempted to submit paperwork related to authority over financial decisions connected to your estate planning. The request was rejected immediately. The signatures did not match existing records. For several seconds, I could not speak. I simply stared at the document lying on Thomas's desk. The signatures did not match existing records. The request had been rejected. On the surface, that should have reassured me. Nothing had been approved. Nothing had been changed. Yet the fact that someone had tried was enough to make my hands tremble. Thomas allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "Margaret, I want to be very careful here," he said. "The rejected paperwork does not prove intent. It only proves that an attempt was made and that it failed." I nodded slowly. Legally, he was right. Emotionally, however, the situation felt very different. I thought about all the years I had trusted Vanessa without hesitation. I thought about every holiday dinner, every birthday celebration, every conversation in which she presented herself as the person looking out for the family. Suddenly, I found myself questioning memories I had never questioned before. Thomas opened another file and removed several pages. "There is something else Harold asked me to preserve," he said. My stomach tightened immediately. He handed me copies of correspondence dating back to the final year of Harold's life. Most of it concerned ordinary estate planning matters. Then one page caught my attention. It was a handwritten note from Harold. Short, direct, unmistakably his. In it, he explained that if anything ever happened to him, I should maintain complete control over my finances until I personally decided otherwise. No pressure, no urgency, no outside influence. Reading those words felt like hearing Harold speak across the years. Thomas watched quietly as I finished. Then he said something that made my pulse quicken. Harold became especially concerned after a particular conversation. I looked up immediately. What conversation? Thomas leaned forward slightly. A discussion involving future authority over financial matters. Harold felt someone was becoming unusually interested in gaining access to information that was not theirs to manage. Again, he never mentioned a name. Yet I already knew where my thoughts were heading. After our meeting ended, I drove home in silence. The afternoon sky was clear now, but my mind felt heavier than ever. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized something important had changed. I was no longer trying to determine whether Harold had been worried. That question had already been answered. The real question now was why. Inside the house, I returned to the reading room and spread every document across the desk. I began building a timeline. Dates, conversations, requests, property records, legal inquiries. The process took hours. As evening approached, a pattern slowly emerged. Significant conversations about my future seemed to appear shortly before discussions involving property, finances, or estate planning. The timing repeated itself too often to ignore. Then I noticed something else. Several of the legal inquiries Thomas showed me occurred during the same period when Vanessa repeatedly encouraged me to simplify my life. She suggested moving closer to family. She suggested selling the house someday. She suggested that managing finances alone could become stressful. At the time, I considered those conversations thoughtful. Now they felt different. Not threatening. Not obvious. Just persistent. Almost strategic. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees outside, I opened the final folder from Harold's hidden compartment. Most of the contents appeared ordinary until I reached a sealed envelope attached to the back. Across the front, written in Harold's familiar handwriting, were 3 words. Open last, Margaret. My heart began beating faster. Whatever answers remained, Harold had clearly wanted them revealed in a specific order. And judging by everything I had already learned, I suspected the contents of that final envelope would explain far more than property records ever could. For nearly an hour, I stared at the sealed envelope without opening it. Harold had written those 3 words for a reason. Open last, Margaret. The instruction felt personal, deliberate, as though he knew I would be tempted to rush ahead searching for answers. Instead, I made myself review every remaining document first. By the time darkness settled outside the windows, I finally felt ready. I sat at Harold's desk, turned on the brass reading lamp, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside, I found something unexpected. Not legal papers. Not financial records. A small flash drive rested beside a short handwritten note. My pulse immediately quickened. I unfolded the note. The message was brief. If you reach this point, you deserve the full truth. Ask Thomas about the recording. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. A recording. I looked down at the flash drive in my hand. Suddenly, every question I still had seemed connected to that tiny piece of metal and plastic. The next morning, I called Thomas immediately. The moment I mentioned the flash drive, he fell silent. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed softly. I hoped you would never need to see that, he said. We arranged another meeting later that day. During the drive downtown, I could barely focus on the road. Harold had always disliked unnecessary drama. If he created a recording, it meant he believed written documents alone might not be enough. That realization unsettled me more than anything I had discovered so far. When I arrived at Thomas's office, he led me directly into a private conference room. A laptop sat waiting on the table. The flash drive remained in my purse. Thomas looked unusually serious. Before you watch this, he said carefully, remember that Harold recorded it because he wanted you protected, not because he wanted you frightened. I nodded. Then I handed him the drive. Thomas connected it to the laptop. A single video file appeared on the screen. The recording date immediately caught my attention. It had been created just 5 weeks before Harold passed away. My heart began beating faster. Thomas pressed play. The screen flickered. Then Harold appeared. Seeing him move and speak after 4 years felt almost unreal. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. He looked older than I remembered. Tired, but unmistakably himself. He looked directly into the camera and offered the small smile I knew so well. Hello, Margaret, he began. The sound of his voice instantly brought tears to my eyes. I had not heard it in years. Harold continued speaking calmly. He explained that if I was watching the video, it meant I had discovered the hidden compartment and followed the instructions he left behind. Then his expression became more serious. There are things I could not fully explain in writing, he said, because at the time, I was still trying to understand them myself. Every word pulled me closer to the screen. Harold explained that during the final year of his life, he noticed increasing interest in our property, finances, and estate plans. Questions appeared repeatedly. Discussions that seemed innocent on the surface somehow always returned to ownership and control. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. I never found proof that anyone intended harm. But I learned long ago that when people start asking the same questions over and over, they're usually searching for a specific answer. I sat perfectly still. The room felt silent except for Harold's voice. Then he looked directly into the camera again and spoke the sentence that changed everything. Margaret, if anyone ever tries to convince you that this house belongs to someone else, they are not telling you the truth. The conference room remained completely silent after Harold finished speaking. I could hear the faint hum of the laptop and nothing else. Thomas sat across from me without interrupting. He understood that I needed time. The image of Harold remained frozen on the screen, and for a moment, I found myself studying his face instead of his words. He looked tired in the recording, but he also looked determined. More determined than I had seen him in years. Thomas finally reached forward and paused the video. "There is more," he said quietly. My eyes immediately shifted toward him. "More?" He nodded. "Quite a bit more." He pressed play again. Harold appeared on the screen and continued speaking. This time his tone was even more direct. He explained that during the final months of his life, he began keeping records of unusual conversations. Not because he wanted conflict, not because he suspected a crime, but because the same topics kept returning. Property, authority, future ownership, access to information. He described feeling uncomfortable whenever discussions drifted toward those subjects. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. One person became especially interested in understanding how control could be transferred if Margaret became unable to manage her affairs. I immediately thought of Vanessa. Yet Harold still refused to name anyone. Even in a private recording intended only for me, he focused on behavior rather than accusations. That was exactly who he was. The video continued. Harold explained that after noticing the pattern, he began creating backups of important records. Copies of ownership documents. Copies of financial instructions. Copies of correspondence with Thomas. Everything had been preserved in multiple locations. If someone ever tells Margaret that paperwork has been lost, he said, they will be mistaken. I glanced toward Thomas. He nodded slowly, confirming that every copy still existed. Then Harold revealed something I had not expected. Several months before his death, he requested a complete review of all estate documents. Not because changes were needed, because he wanted to verify that nothing had been altered. The review found no problems. But his concern remained. The recording ended shortly afterward. When the screen finally went dark, neither Thomas nor I spoke for nearly a minute. My thoughts felt scattered. Part of me was relieved. Harold had left a clear record. Another part of me felt increasingly uneasy. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Thomas eventually slid a folder across the table. "There is one more thing you should see." Inside were records connected to financial accounts Harold maintained during his final years. Most of the information looked ordinary. Then I noticed several highlighted entries. Small withdrawals. Modest transfers. Nothing dramatic. Yet they stretched across a surprisingly long period of time. Thomas explained that Harold flagged the activity because the transactions seemed unusual compared to previous years. The amounts varied. The destinations varied. But the pattern remained consistent. I studied the pages carefully. Then one account name caught my attention. The business name sounded vaguely familiar. I could not immediately place it. Thomas handed me another page. This one contained business registration information. The moment I saw the owner listed on the document, my pulse quickened. Vanessa Whitaker. I stared at the paper. The room suddenly felt smaller. The transfers were not enormous. Yet together they totaled more than $38,000 over several years. My mind raced through old memories. Around that same time, Vanessa launched her home consulting business. Daniel proudly promoted it. The family celebrated it. I even sent flowers to congratulate her. Never once did I imagine my own financial records would intersect with that business. Thomas remained silent while I reviewed the documents. Finally, I looked up. "Does Daniel know about this?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Thomas hesitated. Then he gave the only honest answer available. "Margaret, That is the one question these documents cannot answer. The drive home felt different after that meeting. For the first time since finding Harold's hidden compartment, I stopped searching for explanations and started accepting what the evidence was telling me. Not every answer was clear. Not every question had been resolved. But the overall picture was becoming impossible to ignore. When I arrived home, the house felt unusually peaceful. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. I stood in the entryway for several moments, looking around at the place Harold and I had built together. Every room contained memories. Every wall carried part of our history. And according to everything Harold left behind, he had fought quietly to make sure those memories remained protected. That evening, I spread every document across the dining room table. Property records, attorney correspondence, financial statements, the video transcript Thomas printed for me. One by one, I arranged them in chronological order. By the time I finished, the pattern looked undeniable. Questions about ownership appeared before legal inquiries. Discussions about my future appeared before attempts to obtain financial authority. Interest in the house appeared before conversations about moving. None of it proved a grand conspiracy. But together, the sequence told a story. A story Harold had apparently recognized years before I did. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. His voice sounded cheerful. He asked about my week. He asked whether I needed anything. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that he and Vanessa had been talking about me. My stomach tightened immediately. Talking about what? I asked. Just making sure you are not taking on too much by yourself, he said. You know, maintaining the house and everything. There it was again. The house. Always the house. Always framed as concern. Always presented as practical advice. I listened quietly while he explained that he and Vanessa wanted what was best for me. Then he mentioned retirement communities, walking paths, social activities, maintenance-free living. The same conversation, the same suggestions, the same timing. Years earlier, I might have felt guilty for resisting. This time I simply listened. When he finished, I thanked him for caring and changed the subject. After the call ended, I sat alone at the dining room table and looked at the evidence surrounding me. Then I noticed something I had overlooked before. Tucked inside the final folder from Thomas was a small handwritten note attached to one of Harold's documents. The note was dated only 10 days before his death. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I read the sentence once. Then again. If pressure ever begins, it will arrive disguised as help. A chill moved through me. The simplicity of the statement made it more powerful than any legal document. Harold understood something fundamental about manipulation. Real pressure rarely announces itself openly. It arrives wrapped in concern, wrapped in advice, wrapped in offers of assistance. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time, I understood exactly what Harold had been trying to show me. This was never about a house, never about money alone. It was about control, about influence, about slowly guiding someone toward decisions that benefited others more than themselves. When I opened my eyes, the fear I had felt for days was gone. In its place was something steadier. Clarity. I reached for my phone and opened my contacts. Then I called Daniel. When he answered, I invited him and Vanessa to dinner the following Saturday. My voice sounded warm and friendly. Daniel seemed pleased. Vanessa sounded relieved. Neither of them had any idea that every document, every record, and every word Harold left behind would soon be sitting on the table beside us. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for early autumn. I spent the morning preparing dinner exactly the way I used to when Harold was alive. Pot roast simmered slowly in the oven. Fresh rolls cooled on the kitchen counter. The dining room table was set with the good china we reserved for special occasions. To anyone looking through the windows, it would have appeared to be an ordinary family gathering. In many ways, that was exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, every document was organized and ready. Copies of the property records rested inside a folder beside my chair. Thomas had provided certified duplicates of the ownership filings. The rejected authority request sat in a separate envelope. The financial records showing transfers connected to Vanessa's business were arranged in chronological order. Most important of all, Harold's video and written instructions were safely stored on a flash drive inside my purse. I was no longer relying on suspicions. I was relying on facts. At 6 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Daniel smiled and hugged me. Vanessa stood beside him carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same warm expression she always wore when other people were watching. If someone had met her for the first time that evening, they would have seen a thoughtful daughter-in-law visiting family. That was part of what made everything so difficult. Nothing about this story looked dramatic from the outside. We sat down for dinner and talked about ordinary things. Work, traffic, local news, a new restaurant opening downtown. For nearly an hour, the evening felt almost normal. Several times I found myself remembering earlier years when family dinners were simple and easy. Then, as dessert was being served, Vanessa glanced around the dining room and smiled. "This house is still beautiful," she said, "although it must be a lot for one person to manage." There it was, the house. Again, I noticed Daniel lower his eyes toward his plate. Vanessa continued speaking in the same gentle tone. She mentioned maintenance costs, future planning, the benefits of simplifying life. Every sentence sounded helpful. Every sentence carried the same message beneath the surface. Finally, she looked directly at me. "Have you given any more thought to downsizing?" I placed my fork on the table and folded my hands. The room became very quiet. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Vanessa waited for my answer. Instead of responding immediately, I stood and walked to the sideboard behind me. Then I returned carrying a folder. Neither of them said a word. I placed the folder carefully in the center of the table. "Actually," I said calmly, "I have been doing quite a bit of thinking lately." Vanessa's smile weakened slightly. Daniel looked confused. I opened the folder and removed the certified ownership documents. "Did you know Harold transferred this house entirely into my name before he died?" I asked. Daniel frowned. "What?" Vanessa remained silent. I slid the document across the table. Daniel picked it up and began reading. His expression changed almost immediately. Surprise, confusion, disbelief. Beside him, Vanessa's posture became noticeably more rigid. I reached into the folder and removed another document. This time it was the record of the rejected authority request. "And did either of you know that someone attempted to obtain decision-making authority connected to my affairs several years ago?" I asked quietly. Daniel looked up. "What are you talking about?" His voice sounded genuinely unsettled. I did not answer right away. Instead, I placed the document beside the first one. Then I looked directly at Vanessa. For the first time all evening, she did not meet my eyes. And in that moment, I realized something important. Whatever happened next, this conversation was no longer following the script she expected. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Daniel stared at the documents spread across the table as though he were seeing his own life from a distance. Across from him, Vanessa sat perfectly still. The confidence she carried into my house was disappearing one piece at a time. Finally, Daniel lifted his eyes. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "please tell me there is another explanation." She swallowed hard before speaking. I was trying to help. The answer sounded weak even to her. I remained silent. There was no reason to interrupt. Facts were doing the talking now. Daniel picked up the financial records again. $38,000 is not helping, he said. His voice cracked slightly. And these inquiries to the attorney's office are not helping either. Vanessa looked down at the table. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to find the right words. I reached into my purse and removed one final folder. Thomas had given it to me the day before. I had not planned to use it unless absolutely necessary. Now I understood why Harold wanted it. Preserved. "There is one more document," I said quietly. Both of them looked up. I opened the folder and removed a certified copy of an attorney memorandum prepared by Thomas after one of Vanessa's inquiries. The room fell silent again. Daniel took the paper first. As he read, the color slowly drained from his face. "What is this?" he asked. I answered calmly. "A record created by Thomas after a conversation with Vanessa." Daniel continued reading. Then he reached the paragraph that changed everything. The memorandum documented a question Vanessa asked nearly 2 years earlier. Not about maintenance. Not about taxes. Not about helping me. The question was simple and direct. How soon could ownership of the property be transferred if Margaret moved into assisted living? Daniel froze. He read the sentence again. Then a third time. Across the table, Vanessa closed her eyes. Nobody needed an explanation anymore. The question explained itself. "You asked that," Daniel whispered. She did not answer immediately. Finally, she nodded once. The gesture was small, but devastating. "Why?" he asked. His voice sounded broken. Vanessa looked at him, and for the first time all evening stopped trying to defend herself. Because I thought eventually the house would be ours, she admitted quietly. And because I convinced myself that moving your mother would be better for everyone. Daniel stared at her as though he no longer recognized the person sitting beside him. I felt no triumph. Only sadness. Harold had spent years trying to protect our family from exactly this moment. Yet here we were. Vanessa lowered her head. It started with planning, she said. Then it became expectations. And after a while, I stopped questioning my own motives. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavy but honest. More honest than any conversation we had shared in years. Daniel slowly set the memorandum back on the table. Then he looked at me. His eyes were filled with regret. "Mom," he said quietly. "Dad knew, did he not?" I glanced toward the flash drive still resting beside Harold's documents. "He knew enough to be concerned," I replied. "And he loved us enough to leave the truth behind." Daniel lowered his head. Across the table, Vanessa began to cry softly. Not because she had been exposed, but because for the first time, she seemed forced to confront the person she had gradually become. And in that moment, surrounded by Harold's words, his records, and his careful preparation, the final piece of the mystery settled into place. The house had never been the real story. The real story was how quietly entitlement can grow when nobody stops it, and how one thoughtful man had spent his final months making sure the truth would eventually find its way home. The silence that followed felt different from every other silence that evening. Earlier, there had been confusion, then disbelief. Now there was nowhere left to hide. Daniel sat motionless, staring at the financial records spread across the table. The numbers spoke for themselves. Dates, transfers, account information. Facts rarely raise their voices, but they can be impossible to ignore. Finally, Daniel looked up. His face had gone pale. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "tell me this is not what it looks like." She opened her mouth, but did not answer immediately. For the first time since arriving, she seemed genuinely uncertain. Her usual confidence was gone. The carefully prepared explanations were gone. Even the polite smile she always carried had disappeared. "I can explain some of it," she said at last. "Some of it," Daniel replied. His voice sounded strained. "There are years of transactions here." Vanessa looked at me, then at the documents, then back at Daniel. "I thought I was helping," she said. "Your mother was overwhelmed after Harold died. She trusted me with online accounts and paperwork. At first, I only handled administrative things." That part was true. I remembered asking for help with passwords, online statements, and account updates during one particularly difficult year. Grief makes people vulnerable in ways they do not always recognize. Vanessa continued speaking, but now her voice sounded smaller, less certain. "Then I started my business. I told myself I would pay everything back. I kept thinking I would fix it before anyone noticed." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "You never told me any of this." She lowered her eyes. That answer told him everything he needed to know. I remained quiet. There was no satisfaction in watching my son's heart break. No victory in seeing a family fracture. All I felt was sadness that it had come to this. After several minutes, Daniel pushed his chair back from the table. "Did you ever actually care about helping my mother?" he asked. Vanessa looked up, tears forming in her eyes. "I did. I do." Her answer sounded sincere. That was what made the situation so tragic. Human beings are rarely entirely good or entirely bad. Sometimes people make a series of selfish choices and convince themselves they are still doing the right thing. Harold understood that. I understood it now too. Eventually, I reached across the table and placed my hand on the folder containing the property records. "This house is staying exactly where Harold intended it to stay," I said calmly. "No one is moving me. No one is making decisions for me. And no one is taking control of what Harold spent his life protecting." Neither Daniel nor Vanessa argued. They could not. The documents had already settled those questions. The rest of the evening ended quietly. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just the painful reality of truth finally being acknowledged. When they left, Daniel stopped at the front door. He looked older than he had a few hours earlier. "Mom," he said softly, "I am sorry I did not see what was happening." I nodded. "So am I." Then he hugged me and walked out into the night. After the door closed, I returned to Harold's reading room. The house felt peaceful again. On the bookshelf, the hidden compartment remained slightly open. I smiled and gently closed it. The secret had served its purpose. Harold's voice, his documents, and his faith in me had carried me through the truth. I sat down in his old chair and looked around the room. Nothing had changed. The books were still there. The lamp was still there. The memories were still there. The difference was that I finally understood what Harold wanted me to know all along. Real protection is not about preserving property. It is about preserving the freedom to choose your own future. And for the first time in many years, that future belonged entirely to me.